Hello and welcome back to pytest. And today a quick video on Mastodon and a backup script I made a while back. And we just walked through it. And it's a kind of a cool idea. And apart from backing up toots, as they're called, the equivalent of tweets, you also learn how to do that with a GitHub Actions. So you can use GitHub Actions as cron jobs. And that's actually fascinating. So let's look at it. So since last week, actually, PyBytes is now on Mastodon. We made an account with Mostodon, and you can follow us there. And we put some Python stuff out there every day, ideally. And that raised the question, of course, how can I back up the tweets or toots, right? And actually, Mastodon has RSS feeds. So if you look at view source, we see that Mastodon accounts have an RSS feed, which is cool, which we can parse, but it will probably only give you the last 10 or so items. So, well, or maybe a bit more, but obviously it will rotate and then you will lose history. So I came up with the idea to make a backup of my own feed, and we'll see that it was pretty easy to extend to also back up the PyBytes feed. So I made a new repo, I called it Mastodon Backup. It's public. And I didn't even bother to make a package for this one. It's just a bunch of files here in the root directory, right? So we're going to use feedparser, sqlite-utils, Streamlit, SQL Alchemy, and pytest, right? So feedparser to parse the feed, sqlite-utils from Simon Willison to insert it into a SQLite database, Streamlit to show some data graphs on trends, SQL Alchemy for the database, and pytest for testing. So let me walk through how this works. I have a bit of information in the README. So the goal is to run a cron job to update the toots database. And I also made a trends script, which you can run with Streamlit, and then you'll see how active you are on the service and what tags you're using the most. So it's pretty cool. So let's look at the code. So we define the Mastodon profile link. I have a default user, that's myself, but I can set it to somebody else, as we'll see below. Here we use the sqlite-utils. We make a database object, just hard-coded toots.db. And then we have literally one function. So we have the main block, we come in, we ask for a user from the command line. So if the script is called with one argument, then sysargv will be 2, because the first element is always the name of the script. And if you just run it without a user from the command line, it just defaults to my user here. And then I call updatedb with new toots, and that gets a username. So here I come in, I make the RSS feed URL from the constant. So f strings are nice, but I still find use cases for format where you basically do a variable interpolation. So I get the RSS feed and I parse that first with a helper function, and that's as short as this because feedparser takes a lot of complexity out of the way. So I parse the feed, return the entries, and then I build up a rows list with a little list comprehension. I make dictionaries of ID, summary, publish, tags, media, if there are any media. So actually use getAttr to see if media content is in the parsed entries, and if not, it's just an empty string. And that list of dictionaries I then pass into a database. Now, interestingly, you can use the database object with different tables. So the username becomes the table, and I'm doing an upsert all. And the interesting thing with upsert is that if the row already exists, it skips it, right? So I cannot insert it twice. And that's it. Then it will insert it into the database. So then secondly, to run this, I made a GitHub workflows folder and a backup.yaml file to hook it up with GitHub Actions. And here you see how to run this in a cron job. So there's a useful site, cronjob.com, guru if you're not used to the cronjob syntax. But this basically runs 4 minutes past every 4th hour. That's another trick I got from Simon Willison to be nice on the load, and probably a lot of jobs will run exactly at the hour or exactly at the half hour. So you can be a bit more random about it. So this will run at every minute 4 past every 4th hour. So it will run 6 times a day. It will do the required setup, get Ubuntu, get Python, install the dependencies, etc., etc. And then initially I had only this job, so to back up my own toots. But then to also make it work for the new PyBites account, I literally had to add just 2 lines of code. So I only had to call it again as a separate step. But now instead of my user, I gave it the PyBites handle, and it just worked all fine. And then also notice this last step as I'm writing the database to version control, which I normally don't do, but for Django, for example, but in this case, I definitely want to commit the database. That's the whole point of this repo. I can use the Stefan Zweifel git auto commit action, and then it will actually look for a file pattern. So it will detect that the DB was updated. So that file would be marked as changed with Git. And I can back it up, right? Can make a commit, and I call it backup new toots. So probably if you go into the history, you see a whole bunch of commits, 134, which are not code commits. That's actually the GitHub action doing like a daily or a couple of times a day making backups of my toots. So that's pretty cool. Then lastly, or 2 things more. We have the trans command. So actually already ran that here from the command line. So I can do Streamlit run trans.py. And if I open that in the browser, now you see, actually, let's pull in the new changes as well. And as expected, there was a requirements change. What is that about? Well, we'll check that later. But yeah, the toots database was updated. So if I now call Streamlit again, now I get the full data up until yesterday. And I definitely was more active on Mastodon. By the way, this is looking at my account. I could change it to look at PyBites as well. But I'm just looking at my own account, which has more data because I started to use the service, half a year ago almost. Was definitely more active, putting, sometimes 6, 7 toots out there, but lately I do like 1 or 2 a day. So that's interesting. And then, not surprisingly, most of my toots, 65 of them have the Python tag in them. And that's and that's by far what I use the most for my updates. Developer jumps out, mindset a little bit, and GitHub. So that's kind of cool. And then lastly, I also added some testing. So that's also interesting to look at. So I made a dedicated test database. I use the same sqlite-utils for that. And then I made a couple of fake toots, which I put in constants. And what's interesting about this test module are 2 things. I have a fixture that does a cleanup. So I use a physical database. So I don't want that file lingering around after the test. So I do some tear down after the test. So you can, with a fixture, anything that becomes before the yield is your setup code, and everything after the yield is your tear down code. So this just makes sure that after the test, I'm going to throw away the test database. So there's not, when I run the test again, it would start with a new test database from scratch. And the other interesting thing is I wanted to kind of prove that the upsert was working. So inserting various toots multiple times, and then I have a clarifying command here. Calling this again for the same content does not insert the same content twice. So the actual, after doing another upsert with the same data, so the second test RSS, doesn't cause there to be duplicated items. So that's kind of a nice feature of testing, that you can kind of prove your assumptions, right? And So that's pretty cool. So I think that's what I had for today. So again, no package structure. I didn't aim to make this a package anyway. Another thing, I used the pip tools for requirements. I will do a separate video on that. There's a backup toots that runs in a cronjob, which is configured in the GitHub workflows folder. Runs a couple of times a day. Backs up my toots from my RSS feed. There's a little bit of testing. And in this case, I commit the database to version control as a backup mechanism, where if it was a Django app, I would, of course, keep that database out of version control. And a little transcript, I didn't show that actually. This uses, could be structured better, of course, but it's a little Streamlit app that reads, I use pandas as well to read SQL. So I do a select all from my own user table. Probably should make this a command line argument so I can run it for pybytes as well, or any other user / table that's in the database. And then making a Streamlit app is very straightforward. It just takes a few, it takes a few lines of code relatively. And then I make a bar chart. I make a line chart of the activity and a bar chart of the tags. And the tags, of course, are coming from the database. So I didn't show the database. That would look something like this. So I got two tables. I got my own toots and pybytes toots because I started to back them up both. And so we got an ID, we got the summary, we got the publish date. And here under tags, we got a comma separated list of tags. And that's how I get those. And we also have media if there was an image associated with it. And since last week, those are all the tools we put out as pybytes. So that's what I had for today. I hope you pick up a couple of cool tips from this. You learned how to parse an RSS feed using feedparser. You learned how to make a Streamlit app using a small SQLite database. You learned how to use sqlite-utils from Simon Willison, pretty useful tool. You learned how to write some pytest and maybe something else. Anyway, hope that was enough Python for today. Tomorrow we'll be back with more. Thanks for watching.